We left off where the soul says to the intellect, I understand that anything which is beyond our grasp, I don't expect to understand. But anything which is within the capacity, even at an entry point, to give me some semblance of understanding why something is necessary, I'd be very appreciative. That's where we're at. We left off the whole concept of tzaddik v'ralo, an evil, a righteous person has difficulty in life. It's not great. He suffers. He's persecuted. He's discriminated against. An evil person thrives. So the soul says the aspects and details of what's not possible to understand, I don't expect to understand. But the general principles, which are approachable or attainable, which would give some semblance of understanding why things are palatable, I'd appreciate very much. So now the intellect responds that when God created the world, it was built and willed within the context of justice. There's equity. That's the basis for existence. And he directs it and leads it and wills it. The Mishpat Yoshev in Emon, with a judgment which is appropriate and upholding and upstanding, with integrity. And he says, this we will see with absolute certainty, because the shepherd of Israel, who's Moshe Rabbeinu, he says at the end of the book of Dvarim, he refers to God, Hatsur Tomim Polo, the rock. His actions are perfect, and all his ways are just. The faithful God, which has no iniquity within his justice, tzaddik v'yoshu. He's tzaddik, he's righteous, and he's fair. God is fair. So Moshe, nobody understood God the way Moshe understood God. And he openly attests to what is God. The rock is perfect, his action is perfect, his ways are just. He's faithful. There's no iniquity in his justice. He's righteous and he's fair. And we're going to address all these various points of what God is. So the soul says to the intellect, this fairness within justice and this profound understanding of all this, which you mentioned, that's exactly what I'm trying to understand. How do we reconcile reality of what we see with our eyes with the factual statement that Moshe attests to the fact that God is fair and just and faithful to reward those who rightfully deserving of reward and to punish those who deserve to be punished? How do we see a manifestation of that? And that's really difficulty of tzaddik v'ralo, the Rosh V'tovlo. You take a look in Rashi's commentary on that verse. What does it mean? Kel emunah ve'novel. God is the faithful God. Although in this life, the tzaddik may not be paid, may not be rewarded, because the ultimate reward is meant to be on an eternal level, on an infinite level. Being rewarded or being given any part of that compensation in this world is being shortchanged. I'll give you an example. The Ramchal writes later that it's possible, although a person is a special person, he lives a life which conforms with the Torah, and he's deserving of tremendous, unlimited level of reward. But he wants to have life a little bit easier in this world. And he asks God for a slight payout in this world, not a full payout, very small payout. And as a result of that, things get better, materially speaking, less complicated. But being in a finite state, not being appreciative or understand what the infinite is, after the person passes away, then he'll realize what he gave up for something which is considered fickle, infinitesimal, and of little worth. For something, and what he received in this world, that detraction of what was meant to be in the world to come, is something he gave away mega value for a pittance. So therefore, as a result of that God withholds payment for the world to come, he's doing a favor for the tzaddik. Firstly, there's no diminishment of what he's deserving. Not only that, being able to toe the line, despite the difficulty, this only increases his reward because he's a model of faith and trust in God, that God ultimately will pay him his due reward for that reason. We say Pirkei Avos, we read, it says, Ezeu Osher Samech Bechelko. Who is the wealthy person? The person who's satisfied with his lot. That is the wealthy person. We had learned today in the Daf Yomi that one of the people who are considered like not alive, although he's living, is a person who is in an impoverished state. Oni Choshev Kibes, a poor man, if you're at everybody's beck and call, and at everybody's mercy for existence, it's like you're in a state of a dead man. You have no value. Your opinion means nothing because you're at everyone's mercy. So therefore, the Talmud classifies this person as this is one of the people considered like a non-existent person, the person who's dead. So I said, but factually, according to Pirkei Avos, the way Chazal depict who is truly a wealthy person, is a wealthy person, the person who's satisfied with his lot. You're content with your lot, regardless of how little you have. You're content, you're a wealthy man. If that is the case, you're not at everyone's mercy. A person is truly a tzaddik, unless it's a question of life-threatening, he will not ask anybody to do anything on his behalf. Because he has that level of faith in God, God will be the provider. As it is, it's okay. As long as I'm not distracted from my level of accomplishment, which has infinite worth, I'm the wealthiest man in the world. If every moment of your existence, the value of every initiative has infinite payback, who's the truly wealthy man? The one who's Forbes number one, or this man, Forbes number one, it's all material. It's all for the moment. And it's all fungible. The man who lives a life of spirituality, he understands its true worth. We're talking about the one who understands. He feels he's the most fortunate person in the world because he understands every moment of his engagement in God's will and doing God's will. What does it produce? It produces the infinite. There's a story, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha, blessed memory, when it was like towards the end of his life when he wasn't well, and his yeshiva would have a fundraiser, a banquet, and he was revered and esteemed by all walks of life. And there was this very wealthy Jewish man, not observant. The story goes back maybe 45, 50 years ago. And he was an elderly gentleman, Jewish man, and he paid $40,000 to have the privilege to walk Rav Moshe Feinstein arm in arm into the banquet hall. And everybody should rise for Rabbi Feinstein. You understand? He paid $40,000 just to have the honor of accompanying Rabbi Feinstein into the banquet hall. So what does that say? $40,000, especially 50 years ago, was not a small amount of money. And he understands what it means to have the honor of walking Rabbi Feinstein into the bank. Well, he's willing to pay $40,000. He himself was not observant. So it's a little bit of an enigma. You value what this man represents, you're willing to pay $40,000. But to make the life changes within your own life, to suppress your interests for the sake of God, that you're not willing to do. It's easier to pay the $40,000. Meaning, conceptually, I value Rabbi Feinstein. That's the ultimate. Like people say, my faith is not that strong. I'm not strong-willed. I succumb to temptation. But although I know what the right thing to do is, except unfortunately, I'm too weak to be able to hone up to where I should be. That's what it is. But a person who could internalize and understand the value of spirituality, he has the inner strength and the inner conviction. What does that person believe? Does he believe he's being denied anything because he doesn't live in that mansion, or he doesn't have that special acknowledgement or that special whatever material amenity? Not for a moment. Because he understands what he has is far outweighs anything that exists within existence, within the material realm. That's Ezeu Osher Asamech V'Chelko. The wealthy man, he's satisfied with his lot because the material is only a means to be able to achieve the spiritual. It's only to facilitate the spiritual. That's all it is. So the tzaddik who has the belief that ultimately he will get his due reward in the world to come. What was the impetus to do the will of God? Because God's the creator. I'm here for a purpose. I'm here for a mission. What is the mission? To bring about God's glory. What's the payout on that? I'm not doing it for the payout. The payout is something separate. God will reward me for that. But that's not the impetus. That's not what drives me. What drives me is because I recognize and understand the value of serving the master. That's called reverence. Due to your appreciation of the master, of the creator, you feel privileged just serving that creator. But God's going to pay you in addition. But that's not the issue now. That's later. Therefore, that person can be Samech V'Chelko. With the little bit he has, doing the will of God, which is all that life is all about, he doesn't feel denied as much as an iota, and therefore he's content and he's happy, and he's the happiest person in the world. A person doesn't understand that. He says, he's an archaic Jew. He doesn't understand what the world's about. That's the reason why he's satisfied with so little. But if he would only know what the world is all about, he'd see it differently. That's the person looking from outward inward. The man who's on the inside, he understands what it's all about. I'll give you an example, equivalent case. A person eats a very healthy diet, and he eats very sparsely, protein, whole grains, and never eats to be full. And he works out exercises. Another person goes to a restaurant, orders a 12-course meal. He actually salivates over the food and he indulges. And the man says, look at this other man there. The man's eating barely a survivable diet. Look what I indulge, I eat, I enjoy. But he doesn't understand what he's doing is totally unhealthy. As much as he believes he's on top of the mountain, he's digging his grave with his own fork. He's living an unhealthy lifestyle. But there's no check he can't write. He's happy. And when he smokes that cigar, the $50 cigar afterwards, and inhales that smoke, and all of a sudden, he has a heart attack at 75 because of the cholesterol and the smoke inhalation. But he believed he was on top of the mountain, where all along he was destroying his life. That would be the equivalent of what we're talking about. This person who's into the material sees the tzaddik, who's samech v'chelko, who's satisfied with his lot, who's the rich man, as it's a pity to look at that man. He's so in the dark, he doesn't even realize to what degree he's being denied. If he'd only understand the other side of the equation, he'd see life differently. No, he understands the other side of the equation. He wants no part of it because he understands that's not what he's here for. So therefore, that person, Moshe Rabbeinu, says, Hatzur Tomim Polo, the action of the rock is perfect. God is faithful. There's no iniquity in his justice. He's fair. How can he be fair? Look at what the tzaddik is going through. I'd like I always say, let's ask the tzaddik. Tzaddik says he's more than fair. He feels privileged that God provided him with the clarity and understanding how he has to invest his life. That's the reality. So the soul responds to the intellect and says, the fairness of justice, which you're referring to, the depth and understanding of God's actions are perfect. That's exactly what I want to hear about. And I want to be able to process it, internalize it, and appreciate why it is that, despite the fact, as I said, looking from the outside, it doesn't seem to be the case. There's a story. Rambam, Maimonides, was a great doctor. He was the physician of the Sultan of Egypt. He was the greatest doctor, greatest physician in the world. And since then, they say Rambam, Maimonides was of the greatest physicians who ever lived. And he had a colleague, but the Rambam not only was a physician, he was the greatest codifier. From his time till now, there was no codifier like Maimonides as a Torah sage. And he had a colleague. His name was, who lived in Egypt, his name was Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra, Avram Ibn Ezra. And he came to visit the Rambam. And the Rambam, Maimonides sees he has a certain eye ailment that if it's not corrected, he'll lose his sight, he'll go blind. There was a certain parasite in his eyelid that unless the body somehow expels that parasite, he'll lose his sight. So what did Rambam do? He invited him for a meal, and then afterwards, he knew the food he'd serve him would give him tremendous amount of intestinal pain, cramps, and he'll have to relieve himself. Otherwise, the pains can be excruciating. He invites him, and he serves him the meal, eats the meal, exactly as Rambam understood, because he was the doctor. Within a few moments after he finishes eating, he starts experiencing very serious abdominal pain that he feels like he's going to burst. So he says to Rambam, he says to Maimonides, where's the location I could go relieve myself? Just to relieve some of this pressure. Rambam, Maimonides ignores him. He's like oblivious to his requests, to the point he's screaming from pain and he's crying copious tears from pain. And he cries and he cries and he cries. And this is going on for a half an hour, maybe longer. And Ibn Ezra says to Rambam, why are you torturing me? Why are you doing this to me? Falls on deaf ears. And he continues crying. And after a certain period, he says, you could relieve yourself there. After he relieves himself, he comes back, he says, could you give me a reading on this? If you showed me where to relieve myself, eventually, why don't you tell me immediately? Why do I have to experience all this pain, and I shed copious tears, unceasing crying? Why did you do it to me? She says, I'm going to explain it to you. You had a certain parasite in your eyelid that unless the body would expel it, you'd go blind. And the only way it could be expelled from the eyelid, you had to cry at a level which is unheard of, that the tears would wash out that parasite. And therefore, that's the only reason why you're able to see. Now, from the rest of your life, you'll have your sight. Only in retrospect did he have an appreciation and understanding that all the pain that he endured and all the feeling of worthlessness that he had, the Rambam didn't pay attention to him, was only due to his best interest. So what's tzaddik v'yosher? Rambam was tzaddik. He allowed his screams to fall on deaf ears. He's appropriate, he's fair. Because if he would have succumbed to the man's outcries, he would have had him go too early. And if he would have gone too early, he would have lost his sight. So what's fairness? What's doing the right thing? That was doing the right thing. Do we have any understanding of why God does things? Do we have understanding of many things that may be coming down the pike and to prevent what they may be? Therefore, God gives us certain experiences. They may be painful. They may be embarrassing. There may be many other things, but it's in our best interest. He's tzaddik v'yosheru. He's kel emun v'ein ovel. He's the faithful God. There's no iniquity in his justice. Whatever he does, if you understand it correctly and appropriately, you'll understand why it has to be this way. It can be differently. But he says, that's exactly, the soul says that's exactly what I want to hear. Give me a way to approach it, to appreciate that reality. On the abstract level, we understand it. On the actual experiential level, how do we experience it and simultaneously have an appreciation that we should be able to deal with it, to internalize the reality of whatever that may be? That's not simple. I'll give you an example. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, a work week included Saturday. If you did not come to work on Shabbos, your employer says, don't come back. And there was no government assistance. You fed your family. You did not earn a living. You had no money to put bread on the table. And they were Jews. From week to week, they would go from job to job. They have to look for new employment. Because when they would tell the employer, we're not coming in at the end of the week, they kept it a secret. When they hired him Sunday, the employer thought he was staying through Friday and coming Saturday. So you'd only tell the employee at the end of the week, take his wages. He says, I'm not coming in tomorrow. He says, if that's the case, don't come back. And there were many people for weeks had no employment. They themselves, their families went hungry. It was never a question of life-threatening, but they were deprived, they went hungry, and there was a great degree of embarrassment. But not to desecrate the Shabbos. There were a significant minority of families did not desecrate the Shabbos. For the sake of what? To be a greater provider. To alleviate the hunger from the family. And the husband and wife, they were committed to the same thing. And the children saw tremendous sacrifice on the parents' part. To what degree you have to revere the Shabbos, not to desecrate it. All those families that sacrifice for the Shabbos, till today, their great-great-grandchildren are observant Jews, Torah Jews, and even leaders in the Torah world, because of their sacrifice that they sacrificed for the Shabbos. The other Jews, we're not passing judgment on them, because they did not meet the challenge, because of their difficulty, many of their children minimally became non-observant. Many of them assimilated. Their great-grandchildren are not Jewish today any longer. Because very often you need special divine protection to be able to fend off and ward off all the temptations of society, not to be drawn in to certain situations, which ultimately will cause a person to forfeit his Judaism. That's a fact. What I'm telling you now is a fact. It's a reality of significant hold that was taken. That's the reality. Anybody who's ever today who's not a Baal Tshuva, you ask him, if his great-grandfather sacrificed for the Shabbos, if they lived in the United States, he will say, yes, never ever worked on Shabbos. And therefore, that person is where he is today, and he has an appreciation for his Judaism and is able to continue raising families according to the Jewish tradition. The others, that's not the case. But again, what is the value of that challenge? The value of the challenge. Avram Avinu went into the kiln. He should have died. But because he wanted to kill, he came out. And who was his grandchild? His grandchild was what? Was Yaakov. Who was Yaakov? Jacob was the most special, the patriarch, fathered the 12 tribes. His descendants stood at Sinai and became the chosen nation. Because Avram went into the kiln to die for God's glory and not to bow to idolatry. So do we understand what's at the end of the pike? We have no idea. But if we know in advance what's the end of the pike, you say that's a small sacrifice for what the payoff is. Not that he did it for the payoff. He did it because he appreciated and understood the value of God, revering and loving God. And that's why he went to the kiln, even not to come out of the kiln. And because of that, God performed the miracle. He came out alive to be able to merit to have a grandchild who's known as Jacob, the most special of the patriarchs, for that reason.